reason that I think it's a good idea for me to give you the handout, because I actually write this myself, so you're going to see it. It's like in a conversation I have with myself as I'm writing it, that you can take it and look it up yourself. You can check out the scriptures. You can check out anything you want. You can, just, if you have any questions, just jot them down, and maybe we can have like a discussion period over it or something. Because these are my ideas from what I've gathered over years of studying. So I'm not saying I'm right on everything, or this is the way it's got to be, or anything like that. But this is just what I totally believe. And if along the line somewhere the time passes and it hasn't happened the way that I've looked at it, then I've got to readjust my thinking. I've interpreted something wrong. And I've already been doing that as I've gone along already. Because I think I told you when I was developing this idea of the 3 weeks of Jacob's trouble, the 3 sevens, I thought it began in 1993. And I want to go back over that in a second, but to start with the Hebrew year 5760, which is our year of 2000. The Hebrew year 5760 had always stood out to me as being the most important date in the timeline. I'd studied it even before the timeline was developed, and it has to do with the 5760 egg volume, which is a measurement that they use for the displacement of the water in a mikvah. And I've been in a mikvah before, and there's special regulations to a mikvah that it has to be so much natural water or flowing water. It's not like a baptistry where you can go and turn the faucet on and fill it up and you're baptized. This is totally different, and when you go in, when you're immersed in the mikvah, you're actually supposed, it's usually deep, and you're supposed to actually pick yourself up and float so that you're just totally surrounded. And it's a purification process that you're supposed to be praying while you're doing this. And it's for cleansing, and the Jewish women do it the Orthodox do it every month and things like that. But what I found was when it has to do with the separation and the purification and entering into the presence of holiness. If you go into the road into Jerusalem, there's all these ancient mikvahs along the way, along the main road. We actually got out of the car a couple of times because there's these overgrown spots, and you go down and there's actually carved steps down into the mikvah, because as people went to the temple to present their sacrifices, they would have to stop and they would have to go through the mikvah first to cleanse themselves. And there's up on Qumran, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a huge mikvah up there, and they're all made the same way. The steps go down. You don't come up the same steps, because you go down sinful and you come up the other set of steps. So, because you're pure when you come out. So it's all about the separation and the purification and entering and being prepared to enter into holiness. So what's this got to do with the year? Well, 5760 is the Jewish equivalent to the year 2000, and it's significant because according to the Hebrew calendar, Rosh Hashanah 2000 ended the 6,000 years that was designated for man. The end of the 6th day according to creation, and the beginning of the 7th day, the Sabbath day, the Lord's day. So in 5760, man's time or dominion was up, and the Lord's day was beginning. We were entering the time for what? Separation, purification, when the Lord would take charge and finally begin to implement his perfect plan to bring about the redemption of his people Israel and to bring in the kingdom of God on earth. So that number is associated with the Lord's day beginning. So all of this began for real, for earnest in 5760, the year 2000, the seventh day, the Sabbath day of the Lord. And the number 5760 was the key to the timeline, because the timeline to the end or completion of the age as we know it has been designed around that number. So from the year 2000, knowing that it was the beginning of the seventh day, put my 3 weeks of Jacob's trouble into the right perspective. But I couldn't understand yet why 1993 to 2000, when it fit the analogy of Jacob, who became Israel so well, why that happened that way. And then the only thing I could come up with that fit was that it was a rehearsal. 93 to 2000 was, 1993 was a Sabbath year. That Sabbath year is the last year of the Sabbath cycle. It belonged to the previous cycle. It was outside of the ending of the 6,000 years. That hadn't happened yet. So looking at it as a rehearsal, it was a countdown to what the 70th week was going to be like. And what was the one thing that ties it together? The land for peace. It was the first time, well, let me just follow the outline so you can. The ongoing, from Rosh Hashanah, when I say Rosh, I mean Rosh Hashanah, it means head of the new year. From the Sabbath year of 1993, started this ongoing 7-year peace process that was secretly negotiated in Oslo. And it was set up, the framework was set up, supposed to lead to the resolution of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian problem. It was the first face-to-face agreement between the government of Israel and the PLO, which was Yasser Arafat. And that 7-year sabbatical cycle was a rehearsal for the 70th week of Daniel, because it was a pointer, a pattern, a sign, an indicator of what it would all come down to. It's the principle of land for peace, enshrined in the Oslo Accords, that will be confirmed or strengthened in a 7-year Middle East peace accord, as revealed in Daniel 9:27. It's all about land for peace. But God said, this is my land. It shall not be sold forever. You're just sojourners going through it with me. So God has allowed this to happen only up to a point, and he's going to take it back. And that's what the kingdom is going to do. It's going to return creation to its rightful owner. So the accords were officially signed at a Washington ceremony hosted by Bill Clinton on September 13th, 1993, which just happened to be the Feast of Trumpets, 1993. What occurred in 1993 would come again full circle at the beginning of the 70th week. Land for peace, the confirming of the covenant by the Antichrist. The 1994 to 2000 sabbatical cycle was a 7-year countdown to the end of the 6th day. It wasn't the first week of Jacob's trouble, as I had thought. It was a countdown to the end of the 6th day, the end of the 6,000 years, and also a countdown to the 7th day, the beginning of the Lord's day, the year that would bring the world to the door of what? 5760, purification and holiness, because that's where it's headed. That's where it's all headed. So now I want to touch on the confirming of the covenant. Daniel 9:27 says, and he shall confirm the covenant. Now I'm using the King James Bible because that's the one I grew up with, and to me it just, I don't have a problem with the language because I understand it. Sometimes I'll get another translation to see and kind of get a gist of what else they're meaning by it. But in the King James it says, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. The covenant, is none other than the Abrahamic covenant, the original land agreement, which God gave unconditionally to Adam Abraham. And the details of this covenant I have down below in the side note, and I'm not going to take all the time to go through that because it's self-explanatory if you read it. But it was an unconditional covenant that God made with Abraham, and this is the covenant that the Antichrist is going to confirm or strengthen. It's the God-given right, which is Israel's right to live in the land promised them by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the Antichrist is going to confirm. He's going to say, okay, you guys, you have the right to live here in your, under your God, your covenant, the covenant. Now, it's also going to include the rebuilding of the building of their temple. And it's also going to include a peace and security agreement, which is none other than the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, see, when you confirm something, you're strengthening something that already was. The very first thing that was the Oslo Accords, even though it's changed names down through the years. Roadmap for Peace, and I don't know what else they call it, but the Oslo Accords are the peace and security agreement that's going to accompany confirming the covenant that the Jews can live in the land and have their temple. And that's going to come right at the beginning of the 70th week. So, and then on the next page we have, again, have the rehearsal for the 70th week of Daniel. And I've got the dates down here. Rosh Hashanah 1993 to 94 is the Sabbath year. The Oslo Accords were presented to the world, land for peace. And here's the analogy of Jacob in Genesis 29. Jacob desired Rachel and contracted with Laban, who was, by the way, an Egyptian, to labor for 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. But Laban deceived Jacob and lied to him. He had no intention of giving Rachel before Leah, the eldest. Fast forward to where we are now. Israel desired peace and contracted with negotiations with Arafat, also an Egyptian, and the PLO for the next 7 years. But Arafat had no intention of agreeing to peace with Israel, and had in fact even refused to remove in the PLO charter the written intention to annihilate Israel. It's still there, by the way. Every president has called on the Palestinians to remove that from their charter, and they just won't. It's still there. So this was a lied-to agreement. 93 to 2000 was a lied-to agreement. It had everything to do with land for peace, and it's going to come around again full circle. And there you have the dates are Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, the first year through the 6 years. And then we start on the actual timeline, what I call the 3 weeks of Jacob's trouble. Rosh Hashanah 2000 to 2001 is a Sabbath year belonging to the previous cycle. In 2001, it was the start of a new sabbatical cycle, a new 7-year period. The first week of Jacob's trouble begins. What's the analogy? Jacob is now married to both Leah and Rachel. Jealousy ensues because Leah's bearing children and Rachel isn't. She remains barren. It was a time of trouble for Jacob because he was juggling all of this. Rachel even blamed him because she wasn't having children. But through this, God was building the tribes of Israel through Leah and the handmaidens. The Israeli rabbis at this same period, in this analogy, declare the end of 6,000 years according to the Hebrew calendar. Israel's rabbis announce we have entered the time of Jacob's trouble. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon goes up on the Temple Mount, and the Arab Intifada, or uprising, breaks out amid lies and false accusations of Israeli atrocities and instigation. And for the remainder of this sabbatical cycle, Israel will experience terrorism, suicide bombers, bus bombings, etc., at the hands of Esau's descendants, the Arab Palestinians. So the first week of Jacob's trouble is really trouble. It's physical trouble. It's people being killed. More people were killed in those 7 years than in the 15 years before that. Jews, I mean. So there's the dates coming down through the Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah until we get to Rosh Hashanah 2007 to 2008. It's the second week of Jacob's trouble. Here's the analogy. After 14 years, Jacob is still in Laban's household, although he's no longer laboring under a contract for his wives. This is a quiet year. The year 2000 was pretty quiet in Israel too. 2007, I mean, because they had finished building the fence. It stopped the suicide bombers. I think they only had one suicide bombing or bus bombing since then at all over in Israel. Jacob contemplates going back to his, during this quiet year, Rachel conceives and bears Joseph, which is a type of Jesus. Jacob then contemplates going back to his homeland, but considers the deal at Laban's behest to stay and care for his herds and flocks, agreeing to give Jacob whatever he wants for his hire. So Jacob contracts with Laban for an indefinite period of time in order to build his wealth and inheritance from a share of Laban's flocks and herds. His focus is now on the growth of his domestic product, that is, the economy. Fast forward to 2008. On Rosh Hashanah, the start of a new sabbatical cycle. On Rosh Hashanah 2008, the stock market crashes at 777.68. I think God was trying to get people's attention that would have looked into this, because the 3 sevens are the 3 weeks of the Jacob's trouble. The 3 sets of sevens plus 0.68 was the year 5768. And global attention then focused on the economy, just as Jacob's last 6 years was turned to his economy. So far, everything in the analogy is coming down in perfect harmony with what's happening now. And what's this called? Prophecy. If we knew what happened then, we can know what's happening now. Now, 2014 to 2015, we're not quite there yet. It's not long though. It's a Sabbath year, and it's been 14 years that Jacob has been with her. This is speculation, but I wanted to put it in there. This may be the time, or the season, or the year of the rapture. If you believe, 1, the age of grace will end before Israel's 70th week and the tribulation begins. If you believe that he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way, allowing the Antichrist to be revealed. And 3, if you believe the fullness of the Gentiles will come in and the church will be removed, causing all attention to be focused upon Israel and the redemption of God's people. I am not putting a date on the rapture. It's speculation. It divides people. All I know is that when I thought 1993 to 2000 was the first week of Jacob's trouble, and that error caused me to think that I had to be in the 70th week right now. So I adjusted all of my thinking to figure, all right, if we're in the 70th week, the rapture will likely happen at the midpoint, which would be, well, it would have been 2011. It didn't happen. So I knew right off the bat, okay, I got this wrong, and that's what caused me to start thinking 1993 to 2000, that 7 years was off. But between now and the start of the new 2015 sabbatical cycle, we expect to see 3 prophetic battles take place. I have friends that think that these battles are going to take place once the 70th week begins, but I can't justify that because once the 70th week starts, Israel's army is not going to be able to do the things that it's going to need to do. And once the Antichrist is on the scene, it's going to limit other certain things that Israel will be able to do. So whatever has to happen before the 70th week begins is going to happen between now and 2015, Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, at the new sabbatical cycle. There's plenty of time for it because the battles are short. Look at the 6-Day War. I mean, when they reunified Jerusalem in 1967. In 1973, it was only a few days. So whatever's going to happen is going to be quick. It's going to be fast. It's not going to be a long, drawn-out thing. And that will allow time for each of those battles to properly put in place what needs to be in place to be the catalyst for the War of Ezekiel, which will come at the very end of this cycle or beginning of the 70th week itself, because that's what turns the Jews back to God. That's what puts them back into their old covenant. And that's what causes them to want to build their temple again. And that's what causes the Antichrist to make a pact with them and confirm the covenant. So all these things have to be in place. And that's why last week when I spoke about imminency, nothing can happen like any day or any time. There's appointed times. There's things that have to be set in place before other things can happen. So in 2015, I'm looking at, that's the 15th year. It's the start of a new sabbatical cycle, the start of the 70th week, and it's the 3rd week of Jacob's trouble, from which he will be saved out of with the second coming. So you can see, you can look at it easier than just listening to me talk about it, but during that last week, the 70th week, there's certain things that are scheduled to happen. It'll be the last week to be fulfilled for Israel, that he'll be saved out of it by the second coming of Yeshua HaMashiach. The Jews will return to their old covenant with God following his miraculous intervention and deliverance in the battle of Ezekiel. The Jews will demand to build their temple. And this isn't the temple found in Ezekiel either. That's the temple that'll be built during the millennial kingdom by Jesus, because the measurements and description of the temple in Ezekiel would not fit on the Temple Mount that's there now. When Jesus comes back, the topography, the big earthquake and everything, the topography of Jerusalem is going to be changed in that earthquake. And it's going to actually rise up and be enlarged. And then the temple can fit on it. But right now, you wouldn't be able to fit that temple on the Temple Mount that's there. And the Jews will make their covenant with death, with the Antichrist, who will not yet be revealed. And he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And that is that Jesus has just loosed the first seal at the beginning of the 70th week, sending out the rider on the white horse who goes forth to conquer with what? Peace. The rider on the white horse has a bow, but no arrows. He's going to conquer with peace. This goes along with the covenant of death that the Jews will sign when they make the pact to the peace and security plan, build their temple, and things are going to go along fine for a little short while until the abomination of desolation, which comes at the middle of the week, the 4th year of the middle of the week, which would be Rosh Hashanah 2018. Because at that point, after the heavenly battle that's going on with Michael and his angels against Satan and his angels, Satan is cast to earth. And the scripture says he's full of rage, knowing his time is short. And that's when he's going to go after the Jews. The remnant is going to flee. Most Jews will accept him, though. And that's why, because after the battle of Ezekiel, what are they doing? They're burning the weapons for fuel for 7 years. So that's why, that shows right there that Ezekiel has to happen at the very, very beginning of the 70th week, because all this is going on through those 7 years. And I used to think, well, the Jews are going to flee, so who's going to be there to be burning these weapons? Well, most people are going to be there. They're going to believe the lie, because God's going to send them a strong delusion because they believe not the truth. So there'll be people in place when it's time to take the mark of the beast. They're not going to force that on anybody. You're going to have to worship the Antichrist. You're going to have to be willing to take the mark because you're worshiping the Antichrist. So it's not this, well, you have to do it. You have to take it or you're going to be killed. People that are here are going to willingly take it. They're going to agree to worship and receive the mark. Well, I didn't even put that in there. I don't know how I got it. So, anyway, it's after Satan is cast to the earth and he goes after God's people, he's granted power to continue for 42 months, which is a time times and half time, or equivalent to 3.5 years. And Satan will not possess the Antichrist. He will empower the Antichrist. He's not going to indwell him, but he's going to be the power behind him. And when he sits in the temple and declares himself God, that's when the remnant of the Jews are going to flee, the ones that believe, and then all hell is going to break loose. So, in looking at Daniel 9:24, it's clear that it's God who determined the 70 weeks upon Daniel's people, so God is the one who will finish the transgression. Israel's sin of disobedience will be brought to an end at Christ's second coming, when she repents and receives Christ as her Savior and Messiah.